My name is Nora Messier. I am the manager of education and public programs here at the museum. I myself am new, so I recognize some of you, but not all. I hope I will see you at other programs that we present here in the future. We always like to begin public programs here at the museum with what is now known as a land acknowledgement, especially in the context of the native artifacts that were found as part of this dig and others here on the island. We always want to take a moment to truly acknowledge the fact that the land that this museum stands on, the land that our community now is built on, was once called Nobnocket. It is and was and always will be sacred to the Wampanoag people, and we acknowledge their presence. They're a vibrant part of that community that is still here today. They are not a relic of the past, and we always want to make sure that we are aware fully and consciously of their contributions to our society, past, present, and of course in the future. I am really glad that you are all here today. There are books for sale, copies of the brand new book that is being launched today. If you would like your very own souvenir copy, they are signed. They are $44 plus tax. You can get yours at the front desk on your way out. And because you're not here to listen to me talk all afternoon, I would like at this time to turn it over to our presenters. Please help me welcome them.
First thing I'd like to do is acknowledge a number of individuals in the audience, especially Janet Holliday, our editor. She took a really boring archaeology book, believe me, 15,000 broken artifacts, 10,000 animal bones from the site and so forth, and made it into, in the archaeological realm, a real page turner. So if you don't want to read the text, there's 195 photographs in it. So you can just flip through and ooh and ah. And also I'd like to thank Bo and Van Riper and Bonnie Stacy. They were critical to providing a lot of the images in the book, and Bo with all of his archive experience. Janet was after him all the time, saying, send me this, send me that. And also in the audience, there's a couple of crew members here. Jill Bauk. Jill was 18 years the chief curator of the Martha's Vineyard Museum, Dukes County Historical Society. And David Bauk is here too. And there's a photo of you in here. Whoops. See, oh, I got to turn it on. Oh, all right. I think. There we go. All right. And this is what the cover and the back of the book also has, photographs relating to the materials in the book. And the site itself is up in here on the Tyasquam River, but just at the point up there on the pond. And this is an air photo. This was taken in 1982. When I was flying over, we were digging a site up on the Onassis property, Hornblower 2 site. And so I took a plane to fly over, and Dick had already discovered this site. Dick did a lot of surveys, and he did surface collecting from this site. This is Rainbow Farm, now Gray Barn, where the site's located. And if you look where that impounded pond is right there, just below it into the field is where the house site is located. And if you look way up, the other pond, that's a mill pond, Looks Pond, and Dick has his house sited right on the shore of this thing. And as we go through this, you'll see how important that was to the whole story. Now, Dick did a lot of research in the archives of the courthouse, looking at deeds and so forth. And as we go through this later on, you'll find there's a lot of discussion and debate of where the experienced Mayhew House may in fact have been and might be today. And that will come later. But there are 4 deeds that indicate the exact area and the property of John and experienced Mayhew, which is, you can see the house site there. And also, very importantly, somewhere in this area too, is a 1654 Indian school, the Wampanoag School, that Thomas Mayhew Jr. Established. And there's a lot of discussion of where this thing really was. I think we've pretty much pinned it down. All these deeds with the school and the site itself all indicate it's on South Road, off South Road near the Tyasquam River. It's in this area. Of course, we know where the site itself is. Here's the scruffy crew.
Yay.
On the far left is Jim Peterson. He was one of my students at the University of Pittsburgh. He was the chairman of the Department of Anthropology at the University of Vermont, and one of his associates, Charlie Paquin. And it was a real family affair. That's my mother. She'd always come out and help dig. And then Dick Burt he's got really brown hair. And that's Jill Bauk sitting down in front. And then that's Susan and boy, name just escaped me. Alice Webster. And then David Burt, who's out there. He's a little bit older now. And my father and Lynn Burke. And that's David Douglas. This was his property. And we've dedicated one of the book to him and a number of other individuals. So when we dug the cellar hole, we had to fill it in. So you got a front loader, and he did. He did that. Here's the site before we really got into the cellar holes. And you see there's two of them. And the entryway on the large cellar hole is right at the bottom of the screen. And if we get into it, it's about 10 by 20 feet. And it probably when all the other foundation stones were upright, a lot of them are in the cellar hole itself. It's probably about 6 feet deep. And it's plastered walls. And a cross section of, it's the brick pile. So when this house, we think, was moved, they took the bricks, the whole bricks, all of this stuff's broken. There's very few whole bricks in the site. And later on, we'll indicate where this house might in fact be. This is a smaller cellar hole. This is about 8 by 10 feet, very shallow. And this probably would have been entered through the floor of the house. And there's a lot of ceramics that relate to making cheese, milk pans, and so forth. So it's a buttery, as it were. And here's some of the bricks. A lot of plaster in the house. So it appears that the plaster walls were shedded, and the few whole bricks you can see here. On the bottom, there's a 442. That's probably the number of bricks that were ordered. And then that larger piece is 176. Is it a date? Is it something else? Is it a tally brick? The house itself, when Experience Mayhew died in 1758, we think it was maybe a relative or two might have still been staying there, but unclear.
And what's this over on this side?
Pardon?
What was over on this side of those? Is that plaster?
Oh, this is plaster.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. I didn't know when you talked about plaster, I didn't realize.
Oh, yeah, no, those channels are where the lath would have been.
Okay.
And this would have been a vertical boarded house. This is sort of a sketch of what it might have looked like. And we sent the plans to a number of colonial house archaeology experts, and most of them said, well, it could be this, it could be that, it's a real puzzle, and there was a house there. Now, in 1642, Thomas Mayhew Jr., with a small group of settlers, came into Old Harbor, which is Edgartown, and Charles Banks indicated that they came in a shallop. And one of the frustrating things about Charles Banks' 3 volumes on the history of Martha's Vineyard is he didn't say where he got that information from. This is a shallop. This is based on Gosnold's, Bartholomew Gosnold's shallop that he had on his ship in 1602. And on the right is a chalupa, which is a French term for shallops. This is from Red Bay, Labrador, excavated by Jim Chuck, who was a summer resident and eventually a permanent resident of the vineyard. And they found 4 Basque whaling ships and a number of these whale boats. But look how small they are. So you can just think of these small boats for bringing people into Edgartown. Here's the Mayhew House site, the house. It's 1670. The original one burned down. They built another one. This is where the Federated Church's parsonage is located. So that's pretty much on that property. I always wanted to go in and dig in the lawn, but. Now, of course, when Junior came, the Wampanoag had been here for 10,500 years. And this is Christiantown, obviously, with a small chapel meeting house and the cemetery. And there are a number of surprises here for those who aren't too familiar with vineyard archaeology. This is the plotting of all archaeological sites that have been discovered on the vineyard. And you can see they're located around great ponds and estuarine environments, not in the center of the island, in other areas. They're there for looking for the animal resources, the marine resources, and so forth. So there are about 2,500 sites that make up this chart. This was out of a dissertation, PhD dissertation. It probably took her 10 years to do these things. Now, the vineyard was separated from the mainland around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. And this is a map which shows if the water level was 30 feet lower, and you can see all of the striped areas would have been exposed land. You go back 25,000 years, then you have to walk out 20, 30 miles to the continental shelf front. So it was a little bump on the landscape. Now, one of the real surprises, and David Foster had a lot to do with this. David Foster came in from Harvard Forest, and he cored 29 ponds on the vineyard to look at the pollen diagrams. And they just recently did another 21 on the southern coast of New England. And what they found out was the fact that there's very little charcoal in the pollen sediments. And there's very little agricultural weeds, which really indicates that the Wampanoag were not practicing intensive agriculture. They weren't doing slash and burn because there's very little evidence of burning, and agricultural weeds are not present. This is a 1605 map of Nauset on the Cape, Samuel de Champlain. And if you look at these cornfields, there's a single house in a cornfield. There are no villages. There was a big conference in the 80s in Boston about where are the Indian villages. And nobody came up with a very good explanation. But a little bit later on, when David Foster got going, very clearly Champlain was showing dispersed settlement patterns. So they're spread out. So these shellmins around the vineyard, there are 3 or 4 of them right around here, might be 1 or 2 houses, and that's it. You get in the Western Mass into Iroquois, you've got stockaded villages and so forth and so on. Now, another graduate student took the bones from the Hornblower 2 site up on Onassis property, and first Butler the Dick found in Chilmark, and took all the bones from the site. You can't read this thing very well, but there are 76 species that the Wampanoag and their ancestors were taking. Birds, fish, there's bears on the vineyard, there's beavers on the vineyard, and there are eagles on the vineyard at that point in time. And then you get to the Mayhew House site where there are 10,000 bones. This is an example here. And there's a lot of cattle, sheep, pigs, and chickens. And if you look on the right, this is a Granville Manor House in Chilmark. And look at the landscape. There's nothing, no trees and so forth. You got to think back in this time period, the colonial time period, the only warmth you could get was burning wood in the fireplaces. So later on, you get into the 1800s, and they run out of wood, and they're shipping in firewood from off, and they're digging peat up island, and there are peat houses up there, so that tremendous impact of the cattle for grazing, the fields, and so forth and so on. So the Wampanoag were really sort of forced, in some respects, into a money economy, and pressured and pushed, and finally ended up in the Gay Head, Aquina area. This is the archaeological evidence, which I won't go into excruciating detail, but that projectile point, spear point on the far left, is called a Clovis Point, or a fluted point. That dates about 100 years ago. There are about 12 of these found in the vineyard, scattered all over the place. So not a dense population. At this period in time, it was, again, just a bump on the portion of the continental shelf at that period in time. And so the hunters coming across, we know from sites on the mainland they were hunting caribou. There haven't been any mastodon kill sites in New England, but a lot of mastodon teeth found on the continental shelf underwater by fishing draggers. And these are other projectile points that run the gamut from 5 to 1,000 to contact time period 1642. And here's a celt. And what the cell on the right, this is a Caddo Cell from Oklahoma, a Caddo Indian. It shows you how they have this thing. This is an axe. So they did have grooved axes here, but they also had these celts. This was found in feature 2, the small cellar hole. There was a lot of contact back and forth with the mainland. This is the dugout canoe. It dates about 1500, found in Massachusetts. There are about 9 of these that have been found in lakes and ponds. This is the Whiting 1575 depiction of, in North Carolina, of manufacturing a dugout. And these were intercoastal, and when the settlers came in here, the colonists, they grabbed onto these things and they made them. And they were utilizing them for travel and taking hay and so forth, running up and down the Connecticut River and so forth and so on. They were really tremendous. And one of the things that has become very clear is that the vineyard was never isolated culturally from the mainland. And the Wampanoag were getting a lot of their materials for making projectile points, spear points, and arrow points from off island. There's no bedrock on the vineyard, so there's no real sources except gravel on the beaches and boulders, which are not very good for making weaponry or tools. And if you look at that Clovis Point I just showed you, that's Mount Jasper rhyolite. That's in northern New Hampshire. It's coming down from a quarry there. And there's Rama Bay chert here. A Rama Bay chert is from Rama Bay, Labrador. It's 1,500 miles from here. It's coming down and it filters by on the trade coming through all the way down to Maryland. There's Pennsylvania yellow jasper coming in from eastern Pennsylvania into the vineyard. And there's a wide variety of other stone materials that were coming from all over New England, including soapstone vessels. These were coming. we did a study of one of them. We were able to tell exactly what quarry it came from. It came from Northampton. And so the stuff is pouring in here from off island. And they're, of course, using these conveyances to bring it. This is what we found at the Mayhew site. Just bits and pieces of copper kettles and a little ornament on the far left. These are trade items, those small these two items here, they're pretty sure they're utilized to make beads, so they just roll them into a fairly long bead. So this may well date to pre-1642 when Mayhew arrived. And if you look back into the 1500s, there was a lot of traffic along this coast. And going back to Red Bay, in 1572, there was a merchant from England who counted the number of ships in the St. Lawrence region. There were 350 ships. This was in 1 year. There were French, there were English, there was Portuguese, there was Spanish, and they were all whaling and cod fishing. And it's very clear that a lot of the fishers were coming south. And I think if you were here after 1520, when Red Bay was established, that's 20 years after Columbus, that you'd see, if you were standing on the coast, every once in a while you see a ship coming by here. And Verrazano was here in the late 1500s. He ran by here. And Champlain was running around. Gosnell was running around. This is Cutty Hunk, and this is a supposed depiction of Gosnell's settlement, the trading post. He came, brought settlers with him. Quite a number of Indians came, and he loaded the ship up with sassafras, and they said, "We're going back." And so they left. They made a killing with sassafras to make tea, and made a fortune. This is again back to the map I showed you previously, and the house site that we excavated might have looked something like this. On the upper left, this is the James Skiff house site. It was, I think, was burned down in a Halloween in 1909 or so. But this is on Brandy Brow Hill. So if you're going into West Tisbury and you swing to go up by alleys, there's a little park up there. And there's a big, deep cellar hole. And this dates to 1671. So it gives you some semblance of what it might have looked like. This is the Thompson house. This is in West Tisbury. The wife is standing there with a sheep in the door. And this is the little house in West Tisbury. But what this shows you is the house, but the close proximity to the barns. So if we had expanded our excavations further out, we probably would have hit the barns, some of the outbuildings, maybe a privy or two, a well. Now, David Foster kindly let me use this image from his book, Land and Sea, which he did in 2017. And he was able to take out all the later grist mills and fulling mills and so forth. So here's what it looked like during the period in time that the Mayhew site was occupied, 1672 to 1758. And here's the site. And what happened was when John Mayhew, the son of Thomas Mayhew Jr., when he became of age, his father died in 1657 on a trip back to England to settle an estate, and he was lost at sea. He he met a young lady who was a stepdaughter of the owner in 1668, 1669, of the new owner of the grist mill, the Church Look grist mill, and Elizabeth. And so they got married, and they had 8 children. And he died at a very young age. He was 37 when he passed away. And so Experience Mayhew then took over when he became 21. And both of them were missionaries and supported by the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in New England. And Arthur Railton wrote a great article in the Intelligencer about this society being the largest employer on Martha's Vineyard. And so that John didn't really get off island very much. I mean, he basically was a farmer. He was the minister in West Tisbury, and also a minister to the Wampanoag. And, but Experience Mayhew, he's very famous. I think he'd get famous if he could write a lot of stuff, and he wrote a lot of stuff. Indian converts, and many pamphlets and articles and so forth dealing with Christianization of the Wampanoag. So if you look here, so here John Mayhew comes in, he marries Elizabeth, he lives probably with her parents while they build the house here in 1672, and then they move to that location. And, you know, here's some, in the upper left is John Mayhew's tombstone, 1688. And the one on the bottom is Experience, 1758. And this on the right is Faithful Mayhew. That's Experience's first wife. He had a second wife who was Remember Mayhew. And she's buried in the Chilmark Cemetery. So 1688, that's in the Chilmark in the bottom, but that's in West Tisbury. This is in West Tisbury too. 1688, 1702. There's one earlier one, in 1699, is a Pease a stone. Almost no other stones of this time period exist. And what was happening in this time period, they were putting up wooden markers, and those would decay. Some of them are called bedboards, like a headboard they put at the top of the bed. And so that when you look at this, and you start looking at all these colonial stones, what you're looking at are many of the elite on the vineyard, because these are really expensive. These were all done by Boston carvers. And in the book, there's a whole chapter on everything you didn't want to know about Boston carvers and how the stuff got here, so forth, how much they cost, and what the funerals cost, and so forth and so on. So that if you go to the Burial Hill Cemetery, you get the same thing. You find a few early ones, and then later on, you know, when you get into the 1720s, are all over the place. But just think about it. These people are still here. They're just not alive. And so you can go visit them. You can put flowers on their graves. Yeah. Now, here's what ministers would have looked like back in this time period. This is Jonathan Mayhew. This is Experience's son. He's incredibly famous. He married a very wealthy woman in Boston, Clark, and he became the minister of the West Church in Boston. He was very close to John Adams and really involved with the Liberty movement. He died in 1766. This is the only known portrait of a Mayhew of this time period. Now on the right, this is John Newman. This is 1747. And this portrait is like this, very small. Huh. And it was on the wall of the Federated Church. And so I said, oh, that's really nice. Let me take a photograph of it. He said, well, take it down. So I took it off the wall. I said, this is not a good thing. You really ought to protect this, because again, it's the only other known minister of the colonial time period that we have any portrait of. Jonathan's was done by one of the first major portrait artists in Boston. Now, when he died, his wife got remarried and they had a child, and they named him Jonathan Mayhew Wainwright. Go ahead 4 generations. Anybody know who Jonathan Mayhew Wainwright was? All right. He was the surrendering general at Corregidor. Now this is Judge Sewall. You wouldn't want him to be, he was the one of the witch trial judges. And not a very happy looking person, but a very wealthy merchant. And he was one of the commissioners on the propagation of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in New England. And he made 3 trips here, 1704, 1706, 1712. He'd bring the lieutenant governor of Massachusetts, military people, high officials to the vineyard to take a look to determine how the missionization of the Wampanoag was going. And one of the things that, and the person I really love to meet is Reliance Mayhew. That's Experience's first child and a daughter. And she traveled with him to Boston all the time, starting at 14. And she was 29 when she stopped traveling. And she was they were all going up on horseback. And most of them were staying with Judge Samuel Sewall. And just why this young lady was traveling with him all the time is really a mystery. And there's nothing that we know that would suggest that she's somehow an important asset to his ministry. This is her house, still standing. It's on South Road, not too far from where the Experienced Mayhew House cellar hole is. And now getting into all the broken stuff, these are the ceramics. There are 9 sort of separate types of pottery that have found tremendous amount of redware, which is all utilitarian ware, and was all being imported from England. In the 1630s, during the Great Migration, there were a series of potters that came in from England and established potteries, and they started producing redware. Not anything fancy, just basically redware. They couldn't make stoneware because they didn't have the right clays. Now, one of the things that was happening during this time period, an archaeologist, Jim Dietz, really pinned this one down. This is a site in Maryland, and those black splotches on there, those are fireplace areas. And all the area around it is a scattering of middens of rubbish. And during that time period, these are sheet middens, so-called, that they threw the stuff out the front door, they threw the stuff out the windows. It wasn't until the 1750s they said, oh, why don't we just dig a hole in the ground and bury this stuff? So this is the same thing around the Mayhew House site. And one of the things that when the follow analysis was done, in addition to the cattle and pigs and sheep, the largest population in terms of bones were rats. And just imagine, and they were carrying all sorts of diseases. And just imagine this, and pigs are rooting around in the front yard and so forth. I mean, it must have been a ghastly mess. Here's just a sample, upper left. You get this global revolution, consumer revolution as well. In the upper left are Chinese ceramics, porcelain coming in from China through the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Companies. In the middle upper, that's Staffordshire materials. That's coming from around Birmingham, where all the major pottery, about 100 square miles of huge potteries producing this stuff. On the upper right, this is German, Rhenish material coming from Germany. And lower left, this is salt glaze, which is English. And in the middle is Delft. Early on it came from Holland, but later on the Brits learned how to make it, so they made it. And on the lower right is redware. These are probably butter urns. One of the things we do in the book is we give the backstory on all this. You know, where was it produced, how was it marketed, how did it get here, so forth and so on. And here's some whole vessels. There's a milk plant up in the upper left, Staffordshire in the middle, and other varieties. There's a Rhenish Bartman bottle and a Rhenish mug in the middle there, the German.
Mm-hmm.
So it gives you some semblance from, this site was plowed for almost 300 years. So everything is itty bitty. So you're trying to figure out what the heck we're dealing with. Is it a mug? Is it a plate? Is it, you know. Now, these are fan parts. And this is one from the collections. Fans came in around 1500, and they sort of died out around 1900. But only sort of elite ladies had these things. And you could go to, if you break one, you could go to Boston and they fixed them for you. Lots of buttons. And this is the Jabez Athern vest, 1705. Is that right, Bonnie? Somewhere in that vicinity. And it was his wedding vest. This is the only known piece of colonial clothing from the vineyard that exists. Shoe buckles. And if you note up in the upper left, these are all broken. So, I mean, these are cast out, thrown away. And here's how they operated. Here's Ben Franklin with his shoes. And they fell out of favor sometime around 1800. There was a huge industry, completely collapsed when they got laces and trousers. The money, that's a French coin, Louis XIV coin. And these other ones are all George I coins. These are half pennies. And they're hardly worth very much. We didn't find any silver coins or gold coins or anything that you could put on the market and sell for any outrageous price. Smoking pipes. One of the nice things about clay pipes is that they also have makers' initials on them. And this is Robert Tippett, and he was a Bristol pipe maker. And millions of these pipes were coming because, of course, tobacco was discovered and developed in Virginia, brought in from the Caribbean and so forth and so on. And one of the individuals that gets into this sort of thing said that Robert Tippett, from 1660 to 1760, probably made half of all clay pipes ever produced that spread throughout the world, basically. Now, this was probably one of the more exciting things we found at the site. This is kaolin, just like the pipes are made of, the clay pipes. That little piece up there. You know, what the heck is, I can't make it into a pipe, I can't make it into anything else. And so I just surfing the web and ran onto this king figure on the bottom without his head. If you look at the back of the robe, these are the folds of the robe. And there was an expert in Maryland at the museum there who studied all of this. This is from a site in Maryland. And this is Charles II. And so this is the only, only other one Charles II portion of a king figure from Maryland, and then there's the third one. That's it. They're very small, they're about like this, and they're mold made. And they're probably mass produced, but not very many have been recovered. And then medicinal, there are cootie combs up there, lice combs. Body lice carried all sorts of diseases. There's a fragment of a pot, which is for a salve of some type. And on the right, these pill vials. And if you look at what's going on during this time period in terms of disease, a recent study of how many people there were in the Americas in 2017 studied from 1600 to 1700. I'm sorry, 1500 to 1600, 100 years. They figured there were 90 million people in the Americas, Canada to tip of South America. In 100 years, only 5 million were left. I mean, drastic, catastrophic demographic collapse. So come to the vineyard, 1642, Mayhews arrive. 1643, a huge epidemic. 1645, another huge epidemic. There were about 3,000 Wampanoag here. It killed 1,500. Half of them were gone. Then as you move forward into the 1700s, 1750s, you get to a point where there are only 300 or 400 left. And they're dying of all sorts of diseases, as well as the colonists. I mean, you had smallpox, you had diphtheria, you had typhus, you had a whole range of diseases that were really, really knocking people off. And 1721 in Boston, there was a British frigate that came in, the Seahorse, with smallpox crewmen on board. They came into Boston. Smallpox spread. There were 11,000 people in Boston at that time. Smallpox spread. Almost 900 got smallpox, died of smallpox. 8,000 got smallpox, and about 1,000 people left the city, just like it happened with COVID. They all came to the vineyard. A lot of booze on the vineyard. This is fragments of rum bottles and wine glasses. And wine glasses. One of the things that, when you go back and study this, is the fact that you couldn't drink the water in England, so they were all used to drinking beer and wine and rum and so forth. So that a couple of individuals, and there were books on alcoholism during the colonial time period. There was Cheever, she said the colonists were a nation of drunkards. And then Edward Cruz, he said, colonial Americans tippled, toasted, sipped, quaffed, and guzzled from dawn to dusk. And so if you look at the probate inventory of Cathcart's store in West Tisbury, 960 gallons of rum. I mean, think 50-gallon barrels here. I mean, big casks of this, of booze. And when Winthrop's fleet came in 1630 into Salem area, he had on board his flagship with this migration of colonists coming in, 10,000 gallons of beer. So one of the things they were bringing over was all the ingredients to make beer. And even the Plymouth colonists, I mean, they talk about the lack of beer. They didn't want to drink the water. Now, a little bit on furniture. The upper left is a escutcheon from a William and Mary low boy, high boy chest, and you see one down just below it. So that little escutcheon where the drop is just like that. So here we have one piece that tells us what type of furniture it might have been. There's in the middle upper, that is a some sort of a coat of arms, but it's Scottish. There's no anything on the shield at all to tell us what it is, but it probably would clamp to a trunk or something. And in the middle lower, that's a so-called press. That's a Pilgrim time period piece. And Experienced Mayhew, in his will, the third most important thing in his will was his books and his manuscripts. And he said, I'm giving the press to my son Jonathan. And that's what a press looks like. It's basically a bookcase. And they put linens and so forth on it too. On the far right, just to show you the connections between the vineyard and Boston, that was done by a Boston cabinet maker. It's a dressing table. And it was owned by Ebenezer Allen. And that's his tombstone up there. So there was tremendous back and forth. If you go through banks and look at the third volume, which gives you all of the families and so forth, tremendous number of the wives especially, and some of the husbands, were all coming from off island. I mean, this island was well connected, and Boston was the main source. These are window glass fragments. There are thousands of these, all broken up. On the upper left, these are from casement windows. That's the House of Seven Gables in Salem. So very narrow panes of glass. And those little stripes on the edges, and I'll show you what they are in a minute. And the upper right, this is crown glass. This is the Reliance Mayhew House, Adams House. Double hung windows. That's what we use today. They came in 1700, double hung windows. Now here's the startling thing. If you take stained glass windows and putting the stained glass windows, you have these H leads. So they come in like this. That's what these are from the casement windows. And in many cases, the makers' names are on them. So in the upper one, this is 1677. And John Mayhew built the house in 1672. And then there's a 1714, there's 1732 there, and a 1724 on the bottom, Ezekiel Walker. So that what was going on was they were renovating, they were changing, they were adding on, probably from a small half house to a whole house sometime in, when Experience became 21, and then he started having kids with 2 wives. They started adding on to the house. And the knives and forks, 2-tine forks, 1500 and earlier. These come in about 1650, but earlier all they used was a very sharp knife, almost like a dirk of some kind that they'd spear the meat with. Now what's going on is tremendous globalization of materials coming in and out of Great Britain, and materials coming in from the colonies and from Africa. This is an hagiographic. It's the best one I could actually find. It's really quite good. So you can sort of read it. It's in the book. So you can see what sort of goods are going to England, what sort of things are coming out of Great Britain, slaves coming out from Africa, and so forth and so on. But it gives you a pretty good feeling of the fact that this is really the first major era of real globalization. This is Boston in 1722. 11,000 people at this particular juncture. Big wharf that goes out. They call it the Long Wharf. Now, there was Ann Yentz. She's a historic sites archaeologist. She wrote an article on mytho-history relating to houses. And what she said was, go in any town in Massachusetts and talk to the local historian. The local historian will point out the oldest house of the founding person who settled the town. And so the whole article was sort of indicating, well, this is bunk. It really didn't. So here's, this is the Apotex in Bourne trading post, 1627. The Plymouth colony wanted a trading post so they could trade furs with the Indians. So in the 1850s, they found a cellar hole, thought it was a trading post, dug it up, and now this is the Bourne Historical Society headquarters. Well, later on, more research was done in terms of even looking at the artifacts that came from these excavations, and more work was done by Craig Chartier at the site. He found some of these window leads, 1677, not 1627. and determined from deeds and so forth that this is not the trading post. It's not the location of it, that it's somewhere else. This is the Vincent House. How many people have been in the Vincent House? Now, this is the oldest house on Martha's Vineyard, quotes. And when it was moved here in the 1970s, and you can go to the Intelligencer in 1977 or 8, there are 2 articles. One is by Ann Baker, who is an architectural historian, who went through this house with fine-tooth comb, and Myron Stacho, who was an archaeologist and dug all the way around the house itself. And in her article, if you read it, she says, everybody asks me whether this is William Vincent's house, 1656. And I say, it's not. She hedges her, she really hedges. She said, I'm so frustrated about asking, those people asking me whether it's a 1656 house. And in the 90s, they were putting in a golf course in Edgartown, and right near where this house was located before it was moved to the back of the Fisher House by PAL, the Public Archaeology Lab. Now, when you get into cultural resource management and manuscripts and reports, it's all gray literature. I mean, unless you sort of know where to look for this stuff, you're not going to find anything in the general literature and books and articles and so forth. Well, 700 feet away from this house, they excavated a cellar hole. It had all the right ceramics and everything for 1656. That's where the original house was. Now, in this house, there's a lot of wattle and daub in the walls. And what probably happened is the fact that this house, the original house, was going to pieces and decaying and so forth. So the grandson, Vincent, took portions and pieces of it, moved it over and then redid a new house, incorporating 1656 materials. So if you go to the house, you can say a piece of this or pieces of it are in fact from the early house. This is anybody been to the Hancock Mitchell house? Owned by Sheriff Meadows? They put tremendous expense into restoring the house. This is when it was, a huge tent was over the top of it. And on the lower left is wattle and daub, which is sort of a trigger for indicating this is pretty early. Now, Dick Burt did a lot of research on this house. But Jonathan Scott, if you look at his book, Pioneer Houses of Martha's Vineyard, he has a long discussion of this house. And he gives a very interesting scenario, along with his father, Henry, that in fact, this house was built by Thomas Jr., Mayhew Jr., when he became a missionary to Wampanoag. So he moved here, and it was where this was the Indian school, it was 1654. And so he moved here, he had a family, then he was lost at sea, and then John finally moved into this house and had experience, and then the family started growing and so forth. And so experience moved up to the Whiting House, which in the book is called the Experience Mayhew Whiting House. So a lot of oral history here. Well, what happens is the deed research Dick did proved that this was 1793 for the deeds. And the ceramics, because Jim took and he dug all the way around this house, and under the floorboards is all 1800 and later. This stuff in here is ironstone at all 1830s, and so forth, up to 1900. So archaeologically, this house, just like the trading post, the archaeology really demonstrates that it wasn't as early as people said it was.
Where is this one located?
This is down in Quansu, in Chilmark. you can drive down there and see it. It doesn't look quite that bad, but it still needs a lot of care. This is a Standish house. As you come into West Tisbury, if you went straight, you'd hit it. They were putting a basement under it. So the point here is that there was a lot of moving of houses during the colonial period. And what we think happened to end this talk is that Zachariah Mayhew, who was the last of the ministers, he died in 1806. It was Experience's son, one of the many. And he had a son called Nathan Mayhew. And in a account book that Jill really did a lot of work on from Edgartown, there's a very weird statement in there by Zachariah. Zachariah is buying 3,000 board nails and 8,000 lath nails. Lath nails for holding plaster. You know, nothing else, no other construction materials at all. And so what we think was that Nathan Mayhew, who in fact did live in this house, this is the Whiting house, that the house that we excavated with all of the brick thrown in, only the broken stuff, all the plaster, was to lighten that house and move it. And we think that part of this house, or sections of it, is the original John and Experience Mayhew house site. Now, there's a lot of oral history around this. And of course, with oral history, you can keep your fingers crossed, but there's a bit of evidence. We're not certain it is, but it could be, and so forth. So, because we're pretty sure that this house has moved. It had to go somewhere. So that...
Jim, could you just tell us again where this house is today?
Pardon?
Where is this house today? What house is it?
This is the Whiting house. It's in Chilmark. Yeah, it's just south of where we dug the cellar hole.
Suing.
So they would have, pardon?
Thank you.
So anyway, this sort of concludes, but the book has a lot more detail. Parts of it will put you to sleep, but you know, other parts might be a little bit exciting and fun to read. But it's really the history of the Wampanoag going back to 10,000, 10,500 years ago, right down to about 1800 AD, with the Mayhews arriving in 1642. So it gives you a sense of what was going on economically, connections back to England and to Boston and so forth and so on. So it's a very different kind of book than Arthur Railton's history or Banks and so forth. But hopefully you'll enjoy it if you buy a copy and buy it often. Dick will answer all the questions now. Any questions I can answer?
Most of the activity you described was agricultural, I think.
Right.
What about ties to the Great Ponds? Was there any, besides the spear points, was there any, I mean, fish hooks? Do we have any?
There's a fish hook in the collection. Of course, there's a lot of fish materials in the fauna. So yeah, they were, and the shellfish, not a lot of it, but some shellfish. One of the problems with Tisbury Great Pond, there weren't large amounts of shellfish back in that time period. Not like Menemsha, you know, where the big, huge shell middens, Squibnocket, and those areas.
Well, I got something to say, Jim. I wish I had your memory.
That's my brother-in-law. Yeah.
Jim, the island was pretty much clear cut.
Yeah.
What time period was that when you saw that much thing? Because there must have been a lot of colonists here.
Right.
And then that was a major disruption to the Wampanoag culture.
Oh, yeah.
The forest people, correct?
One of the, yeah, that 1850s, Dick?
Oh, 1850, that's
Yeah.
far in.
But you know, one of the problems with the Wampanoag, you know, when all of the domesticated animals came in, it sort of forced a lot of clearing, building houses, lumber, so forth and so on. But one of the other things that happened, and I showed you some of that coinage, the Wampanoag were forced very early on into using the English monetary system. They had to have money to buy stuff. So they couldn't any longer trade and so forth. They weren't using wampum as they were on the mainland as currency. And so they were forced into this. And if you look at Cathcart's probate record, which was probated in 1720, there's 150 Wampanoag debts. And some of them, they call them bad debts, could never collect them. And when Cathcart died, his wife got remarried, and her husband started suing everybody, the Wampanoag. Now there were a lot of English too that were debtors, about 80 or 90 of them. So it was a very serious situation. So what happened was the Wampanoag were forced, because they didn't have money, to sell their land. And some guy like Cathcart, he was a fraud. I mean, he was, you know, booze to the Indians under the table and all this sort of stuff. It's well documented. And so that's a situation that happened, and it was servitude and slavery and all sorts of stuff with the Indians here. You know.
Did you say shooting or suing?
Suing. No shooting going on. Yeah.
And at one point you said the population of Wampanoags went down to
Right,
400
300 or
or
400, yeah.
And did it then increase after all of those, after the things that
No,
caused it to decrease?
stayed pretty low, yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
do you know how many there are now?
I think in terms of the tribe, 1,400 maybe. There are about 400 in the vineyard, and the rest of them are off island. Yeah, something like that.
Okay,
Just to throw it out, somewhere close. I don't know. Yeah.
okay. Not neck of the
But
woods.
you know, if you want to really learn exactly how the Wampanoag were treated and what happened to them with this invasion of English coming in, and it wasn't just here, it was everywhere, then read David Silverman's book, Faith and Boundaries. That's his dissertation, 2000.
And what?
Faith and Boundaries. That's all on Martha's Vineyard Wampanoag. It was published in 2005. He wrote another book, This Land is Their Land, i.e.,
Oh, like that.
yeah, that's 2019, I think he did that. Also relates to Thanksgiving and so forth. I mean, really, and there's Lisa Brooks. She wrote a book called Our Beloved Kin. And she's an Abenaki Indian. She's a professor at UMass. And she looks at the situation in terms of what was happening to the indigenous Indian groups from the Indian side of it. It's really fascinating how she got into this. And so if you read those three books, I mean, when I first read David's Faith and Boundaries, it makes your stomach turn to what happened to the Wampanoag. Really, it's just a ghastly story. Anyway, well, that's a sour note to start. Well, let me end. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Last question. The furniture that you showed, and I couldn't determine what period all that was, but it seems rather grand, and
Yeah.
it seems like these folks had a rather high standard of living, and how did they earn that? Because they were farmers,
Yeah,
or
there's,
because they were missionaries? Were the missionaries
well,
paid quite well so that they could afford to import all of this material from Boston?
yeah,
I
they,
mean, I kind of pictured them living in, you know, with simple homemade tables and stuff like that. So I was astonished to see this
yeah.
rather grand furniture.
Well, they got salaries from the propagation of the gospel
Yep.
society, and and John Mayhew he also was a minister of West Tisbury, and he got paid too, plus from the society. And he was a farmer. I mean, so he ran the farm. And so if you look at, and it's in the book, there was a tremendous amount of domesticated animals that were being raised here, especially sheep. And we went through the probate records, and there are commercial sheep raisers. I mean, they have 600-700 sheep on their property. They have some in Edgartown, they have also some in Nantucket, and so forth. And they were selling all these to Boston, Rhode Island, shipping, so forth. It's going on. So, yeah. So it was basically the animals that they were raising, and maybe some of the crops that really brought the wherewithal. And of course, shipping too, merchant shipping, and later whaling, and et cetera, et cetera. But, well, let me close on that note, and thank you for coming.